10 verses. The title, Indictment, Sins of the Priests. Well, the remaining 11 chapters of Hosea break down into the same three-step cycle we've seen before. First, the indictment, and that's chapters 4 through 7. Next, the sentence or judgment, that's in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And finally, the restoration of Israel, chapter 11, 12, 13, and 14. Well, our next task then is to examine God's indictment of Israel. That's going to be in chapters 4 through 7. The scene is that of a courtroom, and it is God, Yahweh, who is holding court. This chapter opens with a prophetic call to order as Hosea turns from a discussion of his marriage to Gomer to God's judicial charges against Israel. I'm often running with a fumbling of some words already, so hang in there. Hosea 4:1a, just look at the first part of it. Listen to the word of the Lord. That's the divine, active, living word of our God. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the land has a case, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land. Well, the Hebrew word translated here as case in our NAS version is translated controversy by some and lawsuit by others. So case, lawsuit, same thing. Controversy means roughly the same thing. Now, the verse 4 finishes by giving at least a partial list of causes for bringing the case. Let me read 4:1b, the last half. And here are some of the reasons why God has a case against Israel. Because there is no faithfulness or kindness, that's the word hesed for love again, a powerful, strong word, or knowledge of God. So no faithfulness, no kindness, no knowledge of God in the land. Well, just remember, these charges are hyperbole. I'm sure there were some who would say, well, you can see a little faithfulness here, you can see a little hesed here, there, and once in a while, someone knows God well. But the charges are hyperbole. It's a bit of exaggeration to make the point that as a nation, Israel is lacking in those three characteristics. And the point seems to be this. I'm going to restate my version of what Hosea is really saying. He's saying, I think this, in Israel, there was no basis for fellowship with Yahweh. Go back to Hosea 2, verse 13, and we'll see maybe why that's true, what I just said about no basis for fellowship with God. And this is God talking back in Hosea 2:13 about Israel. And I will punish her for the days of the Baals, that's, remember, the false god of the Canaanites, when she, Israel, used to offer sacrifices to them, that's the Baals, and adorn herself with earrings and jewelry, that's the trappings of the prostitute, and follow her lovers, so that, here's the key, so that she forgot me. That is, God is saying, she walked away from me. Israel walked away from Yahweh. And this is declared by the Lord. And in 8:14 later, we're going to also see this statement, for Israel has forgotten. Israel has walked away from his maker and built palaces. Ezekiel made a similar charge to Judah while they were in exile. Ezekiel 23:35 says, Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you have forgotten me and cast me behind your back, bear now the punishment of your lewdness and your harlotries. Turning your back on God and walking away toward other idols or interests is a form of spiritual harlotry. And so this forgetting is just not something that went out of your mind. It looks like in most cases it's an intentional act. But whatever it is, it means they have separated themselves from anything to do with God. So what is our basis for fellowship with God? Well, we can look at 1 John and find at least a partial answer. I'm looking at 1 John 1, verse 3. What we have seen and heard, this is John speaking, we proclaim to you also, that you also may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So he's saying, you can have the same fellowship that we have with Father and the Son. And verse 5, and this is the message we'd heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Now catch this. If we say that we have fellowship with him, with God, and yet walk in the darkness, do we have fellowship? He says, no, we lie and do not practice the truth. Verse 7. But if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. So fellowship depends upon walking with God, walking in his way, walking in his light, and being obedient. Then Hosea goes on to present God's charge as it becomes much more specific. The first three are kind of general and they are negative. You're missing these things. You're missing faithfulness. You're missing kindness. You're missing the intimate knowledge and connection with God. But now he says, here are the things you do that break this relationship. This is verse 2 of Hosea 4. There is swearing, commandment number 2. Deception, commandment number 8. Murder, commandment number 5. Stealing, commandment number 7. And adultery, commandment number 6. So there are, right there, he's just listed 5 of the 10 commandments that had been routinely broken by Israel at this time. Then he goes on to say they employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. And that's an interesting comment. That bloodshed follows bloodshed in the Hebrew is literally bloody deed touches bloody deed. What does that tell us? Well, it seems that violence was so prevalent in Israel at that time that one violent crime followed immediately after another. So there was just a constant stream of violent crimes within the northern kingdom. And the consequences of the nation's sin were already apparent in creation. Verse 3. Therefore, and that means, of course, because of the sins and shortcomings that were just listed, because of those, the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and also the fish of the sea disappear. That is, all creation had become somewhat lifeless and without vitality. So things just sort of almost as if they came, the important things in creation everywhere and in many people within the northern kingdom just simply almost came to a stop, a halt. Paul supported the notion that sin has affected creation. That's not unique to Hosea. Look at Romans 8:22. Paul says this, "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pain of childbirth together until now." He says it's still going on at the time when Romans was being written in the 1st century AD. However, look at Hosea 4:4. And I'm reading from the NAS, and I'm going to translate it, do another translation in a second. "Yet let no one find fault, and let no one offer reproof, for your people are like those who contend with the priest." That sounds a bit like sarcasm, doesn't it? No one will admit to guilt. No one will accuse another of being guilty. It's like saying, "Ain't no guilty party here. We're all good." No one seemed to buy what the priest said. They argued and refused to accept the priest's judgment. But some translations translate it differently, making it easier to understand what God likely really meant. And let me read this from, I'm not sure what I've got it from here. Probably, I know, the New Revised Standard Version. It says this, Yet let no one contend, let no one argue with me, let no one accuse me, for with you is my contention, O priest. What's he saying? The priests are now becoming the focus of God's indictment. Of course, the entire nation was chosen to be a kingdom of priests, but here he's talking about the religious elite, the religious leaders in the northern kingdom, of course. I want to go back to that Israel as a kingdom of priests. It's found in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6a. This is at Sinai, and God is speaking. "Now then, if you, Israel, the Israelites, the ones he just led out of Egypt, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me," catch this, "a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The priests, of course, were to teach others about God, and that included with the nation, they were to show God to the Gentile world. But with this verse, again, the focus shifts from a general charge against the nation to specific charges against the priests, those religious leaders. Look at verse 5. "So you, priests, will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother." That's a strange thing to say, you might believe. But recall that Hosea earlier used the word mother to represent the nation Israel. He was speaking of Israel as the mother of the Israelites. So the children of the mother Israel were the people of Israel. And this means that destroy your mother then may be just simply a restatement from verses 4 and 5 of chapter 1, where God said he would bring an end to the northern kingdom. Let me refresh your memory and read that. Verses 4 and 5 of chapter 1. And the Lord said to him, that's Hosea, name him, his firstborn son, Jezreel. For yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and, catch this, I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. He says, I'm going to take Israel off the map permanently. The nation Israel being, again, the northern kingdom. Verse 5, and it will come about on that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. We know that that likely refers to the Assyrian victory in the valley of Jezreel that led to Assyria totally dominating the northern kingdom. So what's the cause of the stumbling? The priests are going to stumble, the prophets are going to stumble. Yeah, well, it may be that because there's a lack of knowledge. It was referred to back in verse 1 of chapter 4. But of course, it could also refer to corruption within the ranks. It could be anything. But it says you're going down. You're not going to continue in these positions. But there's something more considering the priests. I don't know if you remember or not, in the northern kingdom, few, if any, of the priests were actually of the line of Aaron. Excuse me, which they all were supposed to be according to God's plan. 1 Kings 12:31 says this. Excuse me. And he, that's Jeroboam I, the first king of Israel, made houses on high places. Of course, that's idolatry. It's worship of false gods. And made priests from among all of the people who were not of the sons of Levi. And of course, all of the priests had to come from the line of Aaron, who was a Levite. So the next charge against the priests, what is it? Well, they failed to teach the people. Interesting what they didn't teach them. Verse 6 of Hosea 4. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you have rejected it. The you is the priest there. You've rejected knowledge. In other words, you've rejected intimately knowing Yahweh. I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, you walked away from the law, I will also walk away from your children. Now, God rejected the priests of Israel, at least partially, because they rejected the knowledge of Him and the law. That is, they didn't seek to know God truly and intimately. For that reason, the people had no real connection to Yahweh. If the priests didn't follow and create or come to a knowledge of Yahweh, how could they teach people to come to that tight connection with their God? So that was the fault of the priests. Not only that, but God was rejecting the nation from the priesthood originally intended for the nation at Sinai, which we read just a few minutes ago. As Israel's population grew, so did her sin. I said Israel's population, but actually it's more likely Israel's population of priests. Hosea 4:7. The more they, And it looks like he's talking here about the priests. The more the priests multiplied, the more they, the priests, sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. It should have been a glorious thing to have been a priest, but if you were corrupted, God says, I'm going to turn that into shame. You're not going to get any glory from being a priest if you're corrupt. So not only were the priests corrupt, they actually profited from the sins of the people. Look at verse 8. They feed on the sin of my people and direct their desire, and I assume this means it could mean the priest's desire or it could mean the people's desire toward their iniquity. Whatever is happening, the consequence of the priest's false leadership means that the nation is centered and desirous of iniquity, not obedience to God. So the priests cherished their own sin and their own behaviors, evidently to the point even of taking bribes, from what many scholars conclude. The reference, interesting, the reference to feed on the sin of my people, it's probably related to the priests eating part of the sin offerings. In Leviticus 6:24 to 30, you'll read about the sin offerings for unintentional sins, and the priests were allowed to eat that. So the more people had to make sin offerings, the more fat the priests became. It turns out they were getting fat in lots of ways other than food. Verse 9 of Hosea 4. And it will be like people like priests, so I will punish them, the priests, for their ways, and repay them, the priests, for their deeds. In other words, the priests were no better behaviorally or spiritually than the common person. And the priests would not have any favor. They will suffer the same fate that any person suffers when walking away from the Lord. And the end result is not going to be happy. Hosea 4:10. And they will eat, as the priests will eat, but they will not have enough. In other words, they'll never get everything they want. They will play the harlot, so they'll say, I'm not getting enough. So they'll go out into spiritual adultery and not increase because they have stopped giving heed to the Lord. There's the reason. They're going to quit paying attention to the Lord, and the Lord says, that's okay. I'll put an end to them too. They were not satisfied. They moved into an increasingly syncretic form of worship. That's spiritual harlotry. What were they doing? Well, the whole thing on all the way through Hosea is talking about where Baalism, the worship of Baal, the false god Baal, is mixed with the worship of Yahweh. And I'm going to talk about that in the next session some more, because it's a major point for the rest of Hosea. And by the way, synchronism in worship for Israel began very early in the wilderness wanderings. You'll remember the incident, but you may not have understood it in the way that I want to bring out. You may have, you may not have. Exodus 32, verses 4 and 5. And he, Aaron, took this, that's gold, from their hands, that's the Israelites, and fashioned it with a graving tool, and made it, the gold, into a molten calf. This is the golden calf incident. And they said, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So what is they doing? They're going back and worshiping a God that they may have worshiped in Egypt, but certainly a God, the bull god, that was worshipped in Egypt. Verse 5. Now look very carefully at this. Now when Aaron saw this, what they had just said, he built an altar before it, the calf, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh, the Lord. What's Aaron saying? This calf represents Yahweh's. So right there, right off the bat, the nation that was to be God's people, God's chosen people, is now mixing Egyptian worship of a bull god with the worship of Yahweh, and all virtually equating the two. No wonder God got ticked. Okay? So this is a throwback back to what they were doing in Egypt. Well, in the next session, as I said a minute ago, we're going to take a further look at the nature of syncretism in worship, the problems it creates both then and now. If you think there is no syncretism in worship now, hold on. And we'll see the focus of God's indictment move from the priests. For the rest of chapter 4, it's going to go away from the priest and now look at the individual Israelites and indict everyone in Israel. Our takeaways will be more prevalent next session. We'll have more of them because we'll see a wider indictment. But let me just say a couple of three things, maybe three takeaways here. First of all, God does not ignore the sins of his people. Judgment begins in the house of the Lord. Secondly, when a believer or group of believers sin without repenting, or if they forget God in their daily life, God will present a case in indicting that believer or that group. Don't think just because you are saved that you may live as you wish. No, God will make it clear that that's not doable. And finally, there are consequences when you forget God and his commandments. If you walk away from God and obedience to his word, you can bet there's going to be a price to pay. Now, don't forget, though, that in the case of believers, that price is intended to bring you back to Yahweh. So, we got a lot to look forward to. We got the rest of chapter 4, then we got 2 more chapters of indictment before we move on to the actual consequences and the sentence. So, look for you next time. We're just getting cranked up now. Things will get much, much more interesting the further we go in Hosea. So I'll see you then, God willing.